Have you ever been told you have an attitude? It's not a compliment. Usually when people think you have an attitude, they don't want to be around you, is what they're trying to say. Guess what? You do have an attitude. Actually, we all do. Our attitude is our disposition. It's our stance before life. It's the way we think about things and let it in. It's the frame of mind through which we greet the day. The gospel you just heard describes a man who had 2 sons. Both of them had an attitude. One was obstinate, saying, "No way, I'm not taking out the trash." Later, he changed his mind. The second one also had an attitude, because he said, "Sure, I'll take out the trash." But he knew he had no intention of doing that. Let me tell you, a bad attitude, it's a liability. It's a liability to everybody in our lives. And a bad attitude is a disability to ourselves. You want to look pretty? Then don't have a bad attitude. It is literally disfiguring. Have you ever gone to a dinner party, or a party of any sort, I guess, and just had about you this bad attitude where you couldn't say anything really nice to anybody, and you found yourself criticizing everything everybody else said and just being altogether disagreeable? Or if it wasn't you, having somebody else at that same table be just like that for the whole night? Perhaps it's because we went there with some undealt with accumulation of resentments over the day. I don't know. But it creates a really negative presence, doesn't it, when it's somebody else? And guess what? When it's us, we do the same thing to everybody else who was there. I remember back when we were doing construction here at the CSC, there were many mornings when I woke up with what I would call a bad attitude to things. Something I had to do that day that I found extremely unpleasant to do, and it was the first thing I woke up thinking about, and so I was in that mood, for most of the day. We were expanding the chapel. We were creating a commons and building offices over there just 4 or 5 years ago now. And when something would go wrong, it would just heighten all the more, or deepen, maybe I should say, that attitude that I had. But we had this one guy here, this one guy from the construction company who was our construction foreman, I guess you could say. And whenever I would bring something up to him or he would bring something up, I would go into panic mode because I'd go, "Oh my gosh, we'll never fix this." And he didn't. He just always said, "Father, we'll figure it out. Father, we can fix this." And I have to say, his attitude was contagious. Even to me, 4 or 5 years later, it was contagious. Bad attitudes are contagious, but so are good ones. We all have an attitude, but where does it come from? We'd like to think it totally depends on our circumstances, on what's going on around us, our lot in life on a given day, what we face that day before us. Well, guess whose responsibility it is for the attitude you have? It's yours. It's yours alone. Yes, our attitude on any given day can be clouded by how we feel, our biorhythms, how tired or exhausted we wake up in the morning. But make no mistake about it, we are not born with an attitude with which we greet that day. We choose our attitude, and our attitude is the only difference between a good day and a bad day, and ultimately a good life and a bad life. It is a very little thing that makes a very big difference, and it is no one else's responsibility but our own. Attitude works even on our suffering. Viktor Frankl, if you remember him, he was a writer. He's a Jewish writer who is both in the concentration camps of Auschwitz and Dachau. And he wrote that in concentration camps, and I quote, "What alone remains is the last of human freedoms, the ability to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances." He talked about the fact that though we are not free from whatever type of conditions others may inflict upon us, we are free to choose how we will respond to that. We are free to choose our attitude towards whatever happens to us. And as Viktor Frankl was being stripped of his clothes, he wrote, "You can take away my wife and my children and all that I have, but you cannot take away my freedom to choose how I will respond." No one can take away our dignity or our joy. We can give away our dignity, we can give away our joy, but no one can take those things away from us. We choose our attitude. People get cancer all the time. People lose their jobs all the time. People face the death of a loved one. We are not responsible for the suffering we face most often, but we are responsible for what we do with the effects of that suffering in our lives, what we will build from the rubble of the lives that are ours. And the difference is attitude. One of our community members just said to me this past week, he's the one that kind of gets to sit through the whole Mass over here, Mike. We were having dinner and we were talking about attitude. I was thinking about it out loud a lot, as you can imagine this week, and my own attitudes and how they work or don't. And he said, and I shared this with his permission, I was a grumpy young man. I was a grumpy young man in my 20s. But slowly I began to realize that the one thing I can control is my attitude. When something bad happens to me, the one thing I can control is how I will respond to things. Don't you find that, my friends, to be the truth? Two people can live in this very same exact circumstances, yet they see things so differently from each other. And I'd suggest to you it's all because of the attitude they choose for themselves in those very same circumstances. St. Louis's own Mary Engelbreit wrote, "If you don't like something, change it. And if you can't change it, then change the way you think about it." I can change my life when I change my attitude. I can change the life of everybody around me when I change my attitude. Jesus had an attitude. As a matter of fact, he came to teach us the power of attitude and how to have the right attitude in our own lives. He came to teach how we can think about ourselves, about each other, and about the world. In the closing line of this piece from the letter to the Philippians, Paul simply writes, "Your attitude must be the attitude of Christ." In other words, if we think like Jesus thought about life, then we will open ourselves to life like never before. Much more powerful than our ability even to succeed is the power of a good attitude, a right attitude. You see, my friends, it all comes down to attitude. Powerful indeed is this. Powerful because it's contagious and truly affects the people in our lives around us. And powerful because with the right attitude, anywhere can be heaven. With the right attitude, anywhere can be paradise. And the choice is ours.